Thank you so much, Heather, for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here talking about two of my favorite topics, that's data and fundraising planning. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about some of the data that I've found through research, and also a process that you can go through to develop your own fundraising plan. So the reason why I am here today is in large part because of something called the Individual Donor Benchmark Report. This is a report that I put together each year for the past few years that looks really in depth at individual donor fundraising, primarily for small and medium-sized nonprofits. We've limited the budget size of folks who can be involved in the study to about $2 million because we wanted to get a clear view for a lot of the smaller nonprofits about what their data looks like. Many of the numbers that I'll go over today and the questions that we tackled today, though, these answers go much beyond just that $2 million budget. So for folks on the call who have larger budgets, I think there's still some really powerful data in this report. So I'm also here because I really love data. I am a mathematician by training. I am a fundraiser by passion. And both of these things have combined to give me a great appreciation for data. So my hope is that maybe you all have this same appreciation for data, or maybe by the end of this call, you will have a better appreciation of data. So I want to tell you a little bit more about the Individual Donor Benchmark Report and some of the interesting findings that we've had over the past few years. And I will say that you all received a link to download the report in advance, and I'm also going to share that link with you again in a second. So here is our infographic, which we called the Busy Person's Guide to the Benchmark Report. And this covers some of the top-level findings in our data. We're going to walk through each of these. In general, we structured the report and the survey around some of our big questions. One of the things that I believe about data is you should only collect data that helps you answer big questions. So here are a few that are answered in our full report. One, just generally, how much could we be raising from individual donors? What does that look like as a percentage of revenue? What does that look like as a gross dollar amount? Second question, how is everybody doing? How are nonprofits broadly doing in this economy? Are they growing or shrinking? How's their individual donor revenue growing or shrinking? How's their online revenue growing or shrinking? Next question, how should we think about our fundraising plan? What should be included? We ask a lot of those kind of questions. Next question, what's our retention rate? How many donors can we expect to come back from year to year? And how much could we be raising online? We also asked about recurring donor programs, sometimes called sustaining donor programs. We wanted to know what those should look like, or what they look like across the country. We wanted to know a little bit about how people communicated with their supporters and potential supporters, including how they communicated with them face-to-face, and a little bit about what their social media looks like. Who makes all of this happen? What are the human resources, whether that's staff, board, or volunteers behind that? The technology you could use to support your fundraising. We also asked, how does this data compare to other similar reports? So we have a whole tab that just breaks out this data as compared to other fantastic resources. And then finally, how'd you get this data? We give you a little peek behind the curtain. So if you're interested in getting the full report and that infographic, you can download it on this website, our website, thirdSpaceStudio.com/IBB 2015, Individual Donor Benchmark 2015. So as I work with organizations all across the country, and as I help them think about fundraising planning and strengthening their individual donor base, or getting their board more engaged, there's been a need for data. Kind of people always want to know, how am I doing and compared to other organizations? And so I want to give you just a few of the top level findings from our research that can help you understand a little better how you're doing. So one of the questions I always get is, how much of my budget should come from individuals? Well, here's what we found. On average, organizations get about a third of their budget from individual donors. And when we say individual donors here, what we mean is people who make a choice to give you a donation. Sometimes that donation comes out of their personal checkbook. Sometimes that donation may come out of their business checkbook. But if it's one person making a gift, that still for us counts as individual donors. There's always that question too about how you think about individual donors. And for me, it's about, what does the relationship look like? So if the relationship is one that you have with an individual, that's an individual donor for the purposes of this data. What's interesting about this number is that this number has held true for the past few years. So we have seen that 33, 34, 35% has been right about where most organizations have been over the past few years of data collection. Now, for most data in the report, we broke it down by size of organization. So you can see here, this is donor revenue by size of organization. That top bar, the orange, is overall revenue. And then the teal bars below are increasing budget size. So you can see that actually percentage of individual donor revenue declines slightly, but seems to hover, even for the largest organizations, right around 30%. Now, we know this is the average. Does that mean it's right or wrong or good or bad? We don't have data that tells us that. That's really going to depend on your individual organization and your business model. But I do want to share a little bit of the data that we got about how this changes based on business model. So this is a large and somewhat complicated set of data. This is actually two graphs in the report smushed together. On the left-hand side, we have number of donors. On the right-hand side, we have average gift. Across the bottom, we have percent revenue from individual donors. And then these categories are the issue focus reported by organizations. So we really wanted to know, how does this change based on organization focus? So if we look, here are a few that I want to point out to you. So what's interesting is if we look at the left and right-hand side, the health and arts, culture, and humanities, both of them have relatively smaller numbers of individual donors. So well below that overall average of about 600. Organizations focused on health only have about 400 donors, and those focused on the arts, culture, and humanities only have about 360. They also have significantly lower average gifts. So as compared to the overall average of 533, they have around 375, 415 per average gift. And you can contrast that to animal welfare organizations who have many more donors, a slightly lower average gift. But they are much more dependent on individual donors, as you can see at the very bottom, that pie chart of 73%. So what does this mean? Well, this means that where your revenue comes from depends in large part on what kind of work you're doing and who supports that work. My informed guess is that health groups might get more funding from government grants or reimbursements than from individuals. Arts, culture, and humanities might also get government grants or foundation grants. Animal welfare groups really are dependent on individuals in their community to support them in large part. You can also look at how this data breaks down by strategy. So what are the specific strategies that organizations are using in their programmatic work, and how does that impact their revenue? So again, same thing, number of donors on the left, average gift on the right, percent revenue at the bottom. And we can see here that organizations focused on public policy advocacy and organizing have a lot more donors, which makes sense given the kinds of work these groups often do. They're going into communities, they're getting people engaged on issues, they may be asking them to participate in community meetings, asking them to come be a part of discussions around specific issues. So it makes sense that these folks would be more dependent, have more donors at that top level. So I want to ask, we've got a poll here. I'm going to ask you, what is your percentage of revenue from individuals? We've got a few different options here. So let us know. We also have an I don't know option. So take time, a few more folks can vote. If you don't know, just give your best guess. So we can see how, at least for this small subset, we get a sense of where everybody is. Okay, I am going to close the poll and share the results. Okay, so we have folks who are less than 25% and in that 25 to 50% range. A few folks who are closer to that 75 to 100% range, and then a couple folks who don't know. So for this group, if we calculated the average, it might be closer to that 35% if we averaged everything together. This would actually be really interesting to do a poll just of the clubs and see what your results are. So let's keep going. One of the other key findings from our research is about half of individual donor revenue comes from folks giving less than $1,000. So one of the things that has been my experience in working with individual donors is there's often a board member, sometimes a staff member, who says, oh, we shouldn't do individual donor work. We don't know anybody who's wealthy. Or they say, we should totally do individual donor work. We just need to get a connection to Oprah, and Oprah will give us all the money we need. And what we've found is that about half of the revenue comes from those small donors. So that they are really the foundation for a strong individual donor program. The reason that we chose $1,000 is that for the most part, or for a lot of organizations, that is where the line is for major donors, those donors that you treat in a more special way. So what we see is that 50% of revenue comes from donors giving less than. And we've got a little bit more of a breakdown here of what that actually looks like. So on the right-hand side in that blue color is what we might call everyday donors. And in the orange is the major donors. So we can see is that on average, organizations have many, many more everyday donors, 581 versus 30. And those smaller donors are giving a much smaller average gift, $208 versus almost $4,000. I'm going to pause here and see if any questions have come in that we want to answer. If anybody has any questions, they want to pop in that questions box. All right, let's keep moving then. So we now know that about 34% of revenue comes from individuals, and of that, half comes from those everyday donors. Another critical question for your organization to think about is, what's the retention rate of donors? How many donors who gave last year will likely give again in the coming year? And what we found is that organizations retained 60% of their donors from year to year. So if you had 100 donors last year, you're likely to have 60 of them give again this year. What that means, of course, is that 40 of them will not give again. And there's many, many reasons for that. But 60, we found 60% it was the average. What was really interesting for me as a data nerd is that this average stayed true across a number of categories. So like in the earlier graphs, you saw how some of the numbers changed by size of budget. This 60% did not change by size of budget. It was 60% for all size categories. I thought, well, maybe there's a difference based on whether or not you have a membership program. Membership programs, in theory, would lead people to be more connected to the organization. There was no difference. I thought, well, maybe it would change if we looked at how many donors you have. No difference. So 60% seems to be kind of a universal truth about retention rates. So now I want to ask you if you have a sense of your donor retention rate. So again, you have the option of saying, I don't know, which is also data in and of itself if you don't know your retention rate. So we've got a couple of categories, less than 40, 40 to 60, 61 to 80, above 80%. So take your best guess if you don't know, or let us know you have no idea. You can click that I don't know button. Give folks just a couple more seconds to put in their vote. All right. Thanks to everybody who has voted. And here are our results. Most folks, about 50% of you, are in that 41 to 60. Then an almost equal distribution of less than 40, 61 to 80, 80, above 80%. Nobody said I don't know. Maybe that's the folks who didn't know didn't take the survey. So what is really interesting here is that when you look at your retention rate, it's not the case that if your retention rate is below 60%, that's necessarily bad, and above 60%, that's necessarily good. It really just means that there's more investigation that needs to happen. So let me say a little bit more about that. If your retention rate is less than 40%, so the 20% of folks here who said that could be because you're doing a bad job at creating relationships with donors. You're not doing all of the kind of retention activities, the cultivation activities that you might want to do. Maybe thank you notes are getting out late. Maybe you only send out one reminder for donations instead of sending out 3 like some other organizations do. So that could be one explanation. Another explanation could be you're doing an absolutely fantastic job at bringing in new donors. So you're bringing in lots and lots of new donors every year, and those new donors are just harder to renew. It's just harder to get them to give again in the coming year. So again, it's a place where you need to have some investigation about what's going on. The same is true for our folks with really high retention rates. It could be because you're doing an absolutely excellent job at building relationships. You're visiting with your donors, you're getting to know them, you're sending them excellent cultivation materials. It also could be because you're not doing a great job at bringing in new donors. And so even though your retention rate is at 80%, over time, your donor base is going to shrink. So I was working with an organization a few years ago that had an 85% retention rate. And at first glance, this was absolutely fabulous. They were really renewing all their donors. But the more that we investigated, we realized that's because almost everybody in their database had been giving to them for the past 20 years, and they had no activities for bringing in new donors. So that was a real wake-up call for them. That 85% was actually a marker that they were not doing an excellent job at building their individual donor base. All right, let's move on. Another of our key findings from the benchmark report: 1 out of every 5 individual donor dollars is raised online. So 20% of individual donor revenue comes in online. This has been growing each year. So it was 13, 14, 15, 16. It's been slowly inching up, and I think will continue to inch up. In a lot of ways, that's fantastic, right? We love online donations. They're easier to process. They go directly in our database. We see them as kind of the solution to many of our woes. But I do want to caution us as we think about shifting more people to online giving. So what I want to show you here is a little bit of data about the average gift. So on the left-hand side, you have your average online gift. On the right-hand side, you have your average offline gift. The orange is overall average, and then the blues are increasing size of organization. So what you can see is in every case, the average online gift is significantly less than the average offline gift. Now, those offline gifts definitely include things like direct mail solicitations. They also include major donor visits and solicitations. So there's a little bit of that in there. But what I want to caution or encourage you all to think about is, if you, like many organizations I'm working with, are looking to shift people from giving through direct mail to giving online, you really have to watch that average gift statistic. You don't want folks to be giving less because they're giving online. So that's true as you're moving people from being direct mail donors to online donors. It's also true for new people when they come in. Really be thinking about the average gift for online, and are you losing out on revenue? Is your overall average gift going down because you've got more folks giving online? All right, any questions? You all are a very quiet group today. Well, I know you're on mute, but you're also quiet in the question box. So I encourage you to ask some questions. Next piece is about board involvement in fundraising. So I was curious to know how many of your board members are active in fundraising in any significant way. So we added in that "in any significant way." And what we mean there is active beyond signing an appeal letter or making a thank you call. Those are fantastic things. We love that board members do them, but we really wanted to know who is putting a little bit more skin in the game. So this includes things like introducing you to potential donors, attending donor meetings, either for asks or for cultivation, being part of the host committee for a donor cultivation event. So really being active. And what we found is that only 4 out of 10 board members are active in that way. So I think this is important for 2 reasons. One is that if you are struggling to get 100% of your board to be active in fundraising, know that you are not alone. There is this mythical, perfect board out there somewhere where everyone participates and the board is totally leading the charge on fundraising. You may be leading one of those boards, and if so, congratulations, but many of us are not. So I encourage you to let yourself off the hook a little bit if you don't have one of these perfect boards. The other thing that this data says to me is if you've got 4 out of 10 people on your board who are really active in fundraising, then focus on them. You can get a lot done if you spend your time thinking about how to engage those 4 out of 10 board members instead of how to get those other 6 board members to be engaged in fundraising. So I was working with a board years ago, and many of the members of the board were actually from other organizations in our community. And I knew that their first allegiance was to those other organizations. And I had maybe 2 or 3 people who really had the capacity and the interest in being involved in fundraising for us. But by just focusing on those few individuals, we slowly built a culture where people really understood that fundraising was fun, that it was easy, that you could make a huge difference. And over time, more and more of those other board members came along and were part of our organization's fundraising. So I encourage you just to think about that as you go forward in your work. All right, and now the last finding, and I would say potentially the most powerful finding. The best way to ensure fundraising success is to have a plan. So for a few years, I collected this data, and I was curious. We knew what the average gift was. We knew what the percent revenue from individual donors was, but I really wanted to know what made organizations successful. So I hypothesized that maybe it was board involvement in fundraising. So more board members means more fundraising success. I thought, well, maybe it means that maybe it's how much you pay your chief fundraiser, right? Not that folks earning more money are necessarily going to produce more, but it's a nice leading indicator of how much people invest in their fundraising programs. So I thought maybe that was true. I had a number of hypotheses, but I shared the data set with somebody who's an even bigger data nerd than I am and asked him to help find what was causing this. And so he went off and racked his head and tried a bunch of different things, and finally he came back to me exasperated and said, Heather, the only thing that I can find is if folks have a fundraising plan, then what they put in means that they get more fundraising revenue out. When they spend more time with meetings, with donors, when they engage their board, when they pay their fundraiser more, that means more revenue. So he was kind of mildly disappointed by this finding, but I thought it was absolutely fantastic because fundraising planning is something that I preach as a consultant, but now we actually had data to back it up. So what this data said is if you invest more, if you have a plan and you invest more, you'll get more results. If you don't have a plan, more investment does not necessarily lead to better results. So there's a number of really interesting correlations in the full report, but I want to ask as we move forward, do you have a fundraising plan? Let's just see. For folks on the call, do you have a fundraising plan? I think we have a clear winner here, but if you haven't voted yet, please go ahead and vote. All right, okay. Here we go. So most of you have a fundraising plan. Somebody doesn't know, and that's okay. Great. So you all have a sense of this fundraising planning thing is important, and you have a plan in place, which is fantastic. So I want to share with you a little bit about what we have seen as the impact of having a fundraising plan. So on the top here is if you have a plan. On the bottom is if you have no plan. So the blue is plan, the green is no plan. So that first column is revenue. So we saw that organizations are about the same size, whether they have a plan or don't have a plan. I thought maybe bigger organizations were more likely to have a plan. That seems to be slightly true. But it also means that this budget revenue size is not the core factor for the rest of the results we found, which included difference in percentage revenue from individuals. So we saw that organizations with a fundraising plan tended to raise significantly higher percentage of their overall revenue from individuals. So 36% as opposed to 27%. We also saw that there was a much greater number of individual donors. So you can see here, not quite double the number of individual donors. And lastly, you can see that the average gift is much larger. So the overall average gift, almost $600 versus just $452. So I want to ask, what is included in your fundraising plan? So fundraising plan means many things to many people. So I'm curious, when you say fundraising plan, what do you mean? So take a second and you can vote for as many of these as are true for you. Our options here: calendar of activities, a list of strategies and goals, a detailed breakdown, an assessment of the previous year, or potentially other things that might be included in your fundraising plan. I didn't include a do not know this time. If you do not know, do not vote, but hopefully most of you who have the plan can tell us a little bit about what's in it. Okay. Thanks for voting. Here's our results. Most folks have a calendar and this big picture of fundraising strategies and goals. Many people have a detailed breakdown of activities, and about half of folks have an assessment of the previous year. This actually aligns pretty well with what we found in the full results. You can see that same thing is true. There's a couple of more popular activities and then some that are less popular. So one of the other really interesting things we found in the data is, in addition to asking folks, do you have a fundraising plan? What's in your fundraising plan? We also ask people, how much do you actually use your fundraising plan? And we gave people options all the way from, I look at it every day, or I check in on it regularly, to I never look at it, just stays on my shelf. And what we found is that those differences didn't impact fundraising results. So no matter the degree to which you used your fundraising plan didn't impact that fundraising plan's impact on your results. So what that says to me is that it's about the planning, not about the plan. So having that plan and referring to it all the time doesn't seem to be the important part of this. It's having those good conversations, doing some analysis of the previous year, setting up some big picture goals for the coming year. That's the important part of fundraising planning. So we're going to move now into thinking a little bit about how to create your fundraising plan. But I want to pause and look for any questions from the group about the benchmark report or the data, because we're going to kind of leave that piece behind as we move forward. All right. Please feel free to chat in any questions you've got as we move forward. So fundraising planning, as I said, means many things to many people. It can also be a very daunting task. So I want to suggest kind of 7 steps to creating a fundraising plan, and also suggest that these steps can be as detailed as you want them to be. So if you are a one-person development shop with not a whole lot of time to do fundraising planning, you can complete this in an afternoon. If you've got a whole team and a lot of board members who are involved, this may be multiple conversations and a whole lot of depth. But these are the things that I think it's important to consider as you're putting together your plan for the coming year. And I hope that now is a good time to be thinking about these questions, given that we are almost at the end of the year. So let's walk through these 7 steps. The first step is to reflect on the past year. So often this is a piece that we skip. You can see in our poll, only 50% of folks on the call looked back and did some assessment of the previous year. But I think this is a really important piece. Sometimes the only assessment we do of our fundraising is, did we meet the budget? Which, you know, is one piece of data, but there's lots of other good stuff that can be gleaned from what we did last year. So I like to look at a number of questions, but one, you know, how much did you raise from each of your individual donor activities? How did your direct mail go? What did your online giving look like? How did your peer-to-peer campaign go? Whatever buckets you break those out into. I also really encourage people to think about, what were your biggest successes? So where were you at your best? This may be about money raised, but it may just be about, in your work, where did you feel like you really hit it out of the park? That might look like doing an excellent job at getting out of the office and meeting with donors in the year. The other piece you've got to ask is, where were your biggest challenges? And that may look like, what was really frustrating for you last year? What didn't go as planned? It's a time to just reflect on what happened in the past year. Second piece here, spend a little bit of time as you prepare for the coming year identifying the resources that you have in your fundraising. So this might look like financial resources. So what's the fundraising budget you have? How much can you spend on doing some of these fundraising activities? So you might also want to look at your board and volunteer support. You might want to consider, what does your technology look like? You might think about, what are your strong relationships? What are the training opportunities you have? But just getting a sense that, what do you have to work with in the coming year? That can be really helpful to put together a realistic plan, but also a stretch plan that can really help you build on these resources. The third piece, as you think about the coming year, really be clear about specific activities that you're going to use in 3 categories. How you're going to find new donors, how you're going to renew current donors, and how you're going to upgrade donors. So these are the 3 pieces that every fundraising plan should include. And they're even more critical in light of the fact that we've got this 60% donor retention rate. So having specific, well laid out activities and goals around finding new donors. Finding new donors is often a low revenue strategy. Sometimes those new donors come in at a much lower level. So there might be a monetary goal around this activity, but it might just be the number of new donors that we find in a year. If you know that you've got to find 40 to replace your donors, put that in your fundraising plan. I was working with an organization a few weeks ago, and we were digging into their data and thinking about success they had just had, which was that they had finally made it to 1,000 members. They had been working on the goal for a couple of years, and they were thrilled. So we talked through this, and we were looking at the coming year, and we realized that in order for them to stay at that level, they had to find 365 new donors, which is nice, right? It's a donor a day. So there's something beautiful about that. But what it meant is that they needed a whole set of activities just focused on finding new donors. In fact, they needed to engage both their board and their staff in specific things to get new donors. So they now have a contest. Every week, one of their staff members is eligible to win a coupon for a free Frosty if they bring in the most new members. So new donors, important. Renewing current donors, critical. These are the bread and butter of your fundraising programs. You've got to renew them and renew them well. Part of this is about building relationships throughout the year, being sure you're not treating donors at ATMs. And then finally, upgrading donors. So how are you going to upgrade particularly those mid and upper level donors to the next level? That may be something that you focus on in individual donor meetings. It may be something that you want to revamp your direct mail to ask specifically for the next category of gift from some donors. But really thinking through how are you going to upgrade donors is very important. All right, moving on. Number 4, create your goals for each activity. We already talked a little bit about this in terms of new donors. It might be around acquiring new prospects and how many of those you want to transition into donors. It might be about trying a new strategy for peer-to-peer fundraising focused on new donors at the outskirts of your current reach. But for each of your activities that you've identified, really think about what are the goals, monetary and otherwise. One of the things that I've seen that's really interesting in upgrading donors is having a goal around what percentage of your donor base do you want to upgrade. Now that can be a challenge when it comes to tracking the data, which is a whole other conversation, but thinking about how many of our folks do we want to upgrade is, could we upgrade 20% of our donors next year? And what would that really take for us to do? So we've now got a sense of the past year, both successes and challenges, what we've got to build on for the coming year, our activities and goals for the year. And the next piece of this is to identify 3 focus areas. So what I see a lot with fundraisers is they get really focused on 2 things. One is, are we making the budget, which we've already talked about, and is definitely a critical piece of being a successful fundraiser. But they also get really focused sometimes on just cranking through the activities. So, well, we know that every November we send out a direct mail piece, and every April we send out our spring appeal, and we do this and we do that. And there's not a sense of bigger picture priorities. So aside from the activities, what are your broad goals about your fundraising work for the year? What are your focus areas? And I encourage you to really think about focusing in on, again, those non-monetary things, but things that are going to have a big impact. So one of your focus areas might be better engaging your board in fundraising. You might have a focus area around really improving your database so that you can consistently pull correct donor reports from it. You might really want to try out a new activity that you're not sure if it's going to be successful or not. So maybe you want to try launching a monthly giving program. But thinking about those bigger focus areas that are beyond just the specifics of your day-to-day activities. Next piece, put it on the calendar. So a calendar of activities is one of our most popular pieces of the fundraising plan. So you all are already doing this. I encourage folks to think about including their fundraising calendar, including in their fundraising calendar, all of the organization's programmatic activities, which I suspect many of you do. I also encourage you now, at the beginning of the year, to put into that fundraising calendar your vacations, your own busy times. A lot of times we want to separate the two, but it's really important, especially for some self-directed fundraising activities, to get a sense of when it's going to be really busy for you and when you might have a little bit more time to pick up some of these focus area activities that maybe aren't critical to getting the budget win this year, but are going to be critical to build the organization's success in the coming years. So put it on the calendar. You might say you want to avoid really big activities right around your annual meeting or when you're going to be taking vacation. You might also want to put on your calendar time to make reminder phone calls or thank you phone calls, but really getting a sense of the seasons of your fundraising and the ebb and flow can be really helpful. All right, the final piece of this, and I think sometimes the piece that we forget, is to make your resolutions. So we know we like to make resolutions for ourselves, but I encourage you to make them for your fundraising. So really thinking about what you need to be successful in the coming year and how you're going to make that happen. So it might be that you realize to be successful, you need an accountability partner. Maybe you need somebody outside of the organization, or you need just a peer in the organization who can help check in with you and see how things are going. Maybe you need time on your calendar to make sure you do these fundraising tasks. So I work with an organization whose executive director is a fundraising powerhouse. She has had a habit for years that every Tuesday is her fundraising day, and nothing gets on her calendar unless it's related to fundraising. So that means she uses that day to meet with donors, to meet with staff about fundraising, to make phone calls. She also uses that day to write grant reports and grant proposals. So she's very protective of that day to do that kind of work. So if you've got other responsibilities in your organization beyond just fundraising, or if there's a particular piece of your fundraising work that tends to always be at the bottom of your to-do list, I encourage you to set aside some time. I work with another person who's a fabulous fundraiser in many ways, but he hates to be on the phone. And so we have worked over time till he's gotten to a point that he blocks off 2 hours on his calendar once every 2 weeks to just make the calls. And he can get through that. He knows it's coming. He knows it'll be over soon. And he protects that time from other things that would normally knock those phone calls to the bottom of his to-do list for yet another week. So really think about how you can make resolutions, how you can develop habits that are going to support the fundraising plan. So we've gotten to the end of my content, but I really want to hear your questions and help answer them. Questions around data, around fundraising planning, around how we got this data or how you can get other data. So feel free to chat in your questions. And Heather, I don't know if any questions have come in so far.
I'm not seeing any yet.
So one of the questions that I sometimes get is around where folks can find data related to communications, related to fundraising in general. So I do want to share with you all that you can find some great data resources towards the back of the individual donor benchmark report. So starting on page 50, there are a few other data resources that are really helpful. So one is called the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. They look at broad-scale fundraising data around individual donor giving, foundation grants, corporate donors, all of that. And they look at retention rate and revenue growth and statistics like that. Blackbaud, the database provider, also puts together what they call a charitable giving report, focused just on organizations that are using their database. So a different data set, but still has some really interesting information. Also, if you do a lot of online communications, marketing, fundraising, advocacy, there's a fantastic report called M+R Benchmarks and they have information from about 105 organizations across the country. Network for Good also has what they call the Digital Giving Index that looks at average gifts through different online giving platforms. So that's a fantastic resource. And finally, one other I'll mention is the Nonprofit Marketing Guide, 2016 Nonprofit Communications Trends Report. So that's a great resource that looks at all kinds of data reported by communications professionals. So I encourage you to check that out too. All right. Well, Heather, I'm not sure we've got any questions. Oh, we do have a question.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So Stephanie Kane made a comment. She said, according to the National Center for Charitable Statistics, giving by individuals makes up the vast majority of contributions received by nonprofit organizations. Giving USA 2005 estimates that individual giving amounted to $258.51 billion in 2014, an increase of 7.1% in current dollars from 2013. This accounts for 72% of all contributions received in 2014. This seems to conflict with your report findings.
That's a great question. So, Stephanie, I think there's a couple of things to consider there. One is that data comes actually from looking at all nonprofits, and so they cast a relatively wide net. So that does include churches, universities, hospitals. So that revenue from individuals sometimes gets a little skewed because you really are looking at a much different universe. Our data does not include those. It does not include the large institutions that are getting those $1 million gifts. Our data is looking at the smaller, more traditional nonprofits. Doesn't include churches and universities. So that's how I've often seen that statistic explained, is that when you look at that much bigger universe of nonprofits, the 72% does hold true in that larger universe. Great question. All right. Well, Heather, thank you so much for having me on the webinar today.